One of the things that we love about Lisa C. is that she can fill a period of history with richly and accurately researched historical details, embody characters that bring those details alive, and explain the complicated relationships between women that are, the friendships, the challenges, sometimes the external forces that are just really so challenging in a woman's life, or in her friendships, or in her projects, or in her learning how to dive, or learning how to be a medical doctor, or in serving tea, or being displaced from their home. We love these things about Lisa C.'s books. And before she takes us back to the Ming Dynasty and Lady Tan's circle of women, I want to take us back to March of 2020. Remember what you were all doing in March of 2020? How many of you came to our event when we hosted Lisa C. the day before the pandemic was announced? Yeah. There weren't as many people here. And we were panicked. And all that day, the day before, people were asking, what precautions are you going to take? And we were pacing the store trying to figure out what the right thing was to do. Do you require masks? If so, how big should they be? How big should our bottle of hand sanitizer be so that there's enough for everyone and to keep Lisa protected? So that's the recent past. Lisa C.'s last event in Wichita was the last event we hosted before the pandemic and before the shutdown. So I'm delighted to say that we're all still here. We are all happily gathered in this wonderful group, and to welcome to Wichita one of my favorite authors, and I know yours too, Lisa C. We're getting organized up here. It's funny, when I was out talking for this book for the hardcover, I always started with the pandemic, and I'm going to have to start there again anyway. Even though you just heard that this was my last stop and the last stop before everything shut down. First of all, thank you all so much for coming. It's so wonderful to see you all. And I have to tell you, this is my week in the Midwest, which means I'm 3 hours off in my sleeping. I'm off from Los Angeles. And this morning I was picked up at the hotel in Cleveland at 4:30 Cleveland time, which is 1:30 my time. And tomorrow I get picked up at again 4:15 to go, I think, or 4 to go to the airport, which is still like 1 o'clock my time. And when I talked to my husband this afternoon in the hotel lobby, I made 4 mistakes in 10 minutes just talking to him. So just bear with me. Big time. All right. So what I wanted to do tonight is talk about how books come to me, in particular, Lady Tan's Circle of Women. And is it fate? Is it fortune? Is it destiny? Good luck? Bad luck? Dumb luck? What I can tell you is that I think about books for a very long time before I decide this is the one. So with the last one, Island of Sea Women, it was 8 years. With Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane, I thought about that for 20 years before I had my way in. But this was completely different, and you do have to go back in time. 4.5 years, I had just gone out on book tour for the hardcover of Island of Sea Women. I left on March 10th, 2020. I was supposed to be out on the road for 6 weeks. And this was my 4th stop and my last stop because that was it. The tour was canceled, everything was canceled, and it was just how quickly can I get home, and then the country shut down, the world shut down, and that was that. And so in a way you would think this is a great thing for a writer, because now you have no distractions, you're just home, you can just work. Here's the thing, I had already been quietly working on something while I was, sorry, I already got mixed up. The hardcover came out, I went out on tour. Then, see, this is because I'm sleep deprived. I had already started doing research on what I thought was going to be the next book. It was something I'd been thinking about for 10 years. Then the paperback came out. Then I went out on tour. Then the pandemic came, and then I went home. And so you would think I had started doing the research. I could just continue doing the research and get to work and writing. Here was the problem. All of the libraries were closed. All of the research libraries were closed. And this particular book was going to require a trip deep, deep, deep into a very, very remote part of China. No way to do that. And China remained effectively closed until about a year and a half ago. So I didn't know what to do with myself. There I was, home alone with my husband, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And and totally at loose ends. I cleaned out the closets. I didn't get into the whole banana baking thing, but I did clean out all the closets. I ordered my first ever pair of pajamas. You can see things were not going well. There was this part of me, and I don't mean to sound melodramatic, but a part of me that felt like, well, my life is over. Because I couldn't do the things that I do. I mean, I couldn't do any research, I couldn't work on that project, and I really, truly was moping around the house. And it wasn't until October of that year, I was walking through my office, and I do have, in my house, and I have this whole wall of research books. And the spine of one of them kind of jumped out at me, and I don't know why. It was a gray jacket with slightly darker gray lettering, but it was like it jumped off the shelf and into my hands. Reproducing Women, Pregnancy and Childbirth in the Ming Dynasty. And I opened it up. I had had that book on my shelf for 10 years. Not only had I never read it, I had never opened it before. But I thought to myself, well, here we are in the middle of a global pandemic. My life is over. I might as well sit down and start reading it right now. And I did. And I got to page 19. And there was a mention of a woman doctor, Tan Yunxian, who in the Ming Dynasty 500 years ago had published a book of her medical cases. And I set the book down, I went to the computer to look her up and discovered that her book was still in print, not just in Chinese, but also in English. And so while I am a huge, huge, huge supporter of independent bookstores, the whole tour is independent bookstores, on that day in the middle of the pandemic, I may have ordered one. And I had the book in 24 hours. And so instead of thinking about this for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it was all of 26 hours. So what was it about this story that just completely captivated me? So we can take it from the top. A woman doctor 500 years ago in China. Now think about it. How many women doctors were there in the entire world at that time? How many even trained male doctors were there in the world at that time? So the fact that she was a woman doctor, that was amazing. Who, when she turned 50, another fact I liked a lot, published a book of her medical cases in 1511. Now think about it, 1511. How many other books can you think of that are still in print from before 1511? The Bible, the Iliad and the Odyssey, some Greek tragedies and comedies. We can go beyond the Western canon and say the Mahabharata from India, I Ching, Book of Odes from China, all of those written by men. There are some things written by women that have survived from before 1511. The Tales of Genji from Japan. And then there was a woman, a Catholic nun, Hildegard von Bingen, some of you may have heard of her, who in the 12th century published 2 books. Now, she was remarkable. She was a Catholic nun, an abbess, a poet, a composer, but also dabbled in medicine. And so her book is quite similar to Tan Yunxian's in the sense that she has these recipes to make homemade remedies for if you have a sore throat or an upset stomach or gout, or you want to get pregnant, or you want to end an unwanted pregnancy. This Catholic nun had the recipe for it in the 12th century. But again, these are very, very few and far between, and we still have to go like hundreds of years before you start to hit women like Jane Austen, Emily Dickinson, who else? The Bronte sisters, George Sand, Edith Wharton, and it's really not until 100 years ago when Virginia Woolf starts publishing her fiction in the 1920s that women's writing starts to stick and starts to stay in print. So all of this just was like incredible to me. Little is known about Tan Yunxian's life. There are a few things in her book. There's some forewords written by different men in her family. There are a couple of afterwords written by other men. And then she wrote an introduction that talks about her life and how she became a doctor. And so when she was 8 years old, she went to live with her grandparents. And her grandfather, like many grandfathers and grandmothers, liked to have a glass of wine in the evening and have this little 8-year-old girl recite classical Chinese poetry to him. And apparently one night he said, and this is his direct quote, "This girl is very intelligent. We should not restrict her to ordinary needlework, but instead let her study my medicine." In fact, she really learned how to be a doctor from her grandmother, but that never would have happened if her grandfather hadn't given his stamp of approval. Tan Yunxian was quite sickly. If you haven't read the book yet, don't worry, I won't give away, really major spoilers, so just be prepared for some things. And don't be surprised that she was quite sickly. She comes close to death several times. And there does come a point when she is so close to death that she can hear her husband and mother-in-law sitting right by her bedside planning her funeral. Not something you want to hear. And that very night, her grandmother, who had been dead now for several years, came to visit her. Was this a fever dream? Was this a hallucination? Was it a ghost? As a writer, I had to really think about that. And I decided it really didn't matter what I thought. Tan Yunxian believed that her grandmother came to see her. And her grandmother, I'm going to paraphrase here, said something along the lines of, "Enough of this being sick business. You are a big embarrassment to the family, and you need to pull yourself together. And if you go to one of my old medical notebooks that you inherited when I died, and you look on page 78, and you follow the recipe there exactly to the letter, and you take it exactly as I wrote it, you're going to get better. And not only are you going to get better, but you're never going to get sick again." And this turned out to be true. Her grandmother said, and again I'm paraphrasing, "As long as I'm here, I want to tell you something else. You're going to live to be 73. Pretty old in the Ming Dynasty. Well, in this, her grandmother was wrong because she actually lived to be 96. Nice age now, really incredible, 500 years ago. All right, so what else captivated me about this woman? First, she really circumvented the rules about what a woman could and could not do. This was really a time in China, the height of Confucianism, and where Confucian thought really permeated society, culture, family. And, Confucius, I think it's fair to say, he was a great thinker. He was a great philosopher. There's no question about that. But it's also true, he really didn't care for women. Just really didn't. And so he has all these sayings, things like, when a girl obey her father, when a wife obey her husband, when a widow obey her son. A good woman will never go more than 3 steps beyond her front gate. And my personal favorite, an educated woman is a worthless woman. So here was someone who looked like a proper Confucian woman. She went into an arranged marriage when she was 15. She had 4 children. She took care of her husband's household. And yet, she also had become a doctor and a writer. The other thing had to do with traditions around traditional Chinese medicine. There was a saying in that time used by doctors that was, a woman is 10 times more difficult to treat than a man. Well, of course, doctors would have said that because 99.9999999% of them were men. And here's the thing, male doctors could not see their female patients. They had to be behind a curtain, behind a screen, or better yet, out there in the hallway. And so what would happen is that a girl's father or a woman's husband would act as the go-between. And, the husband would go out to the hallway, get the question, come back, ask the woman, come back with the answer. I love my husband and sons a lot, but I would not want them to be the go-between between me and any of my doctors, but particularly, my gynecologist, right? So the difference was that Tan Yunxian could be in the room with her patients. She could look at them. Was a woman flushed? Was she pale? Was she swollen? Did she have a rash? She could smell her. We know so many illnesses have odors attached to them. She could touch them. In traditional Chinese medicine, there are 26 pulses that doctors feel. But for a male doctor to feel a woman's pulse, she had to be, this close to death. And what would happen, and this is where it's hard if I have to hold a microphone, they would come and wrap her wrist in these long strips of cloth. She'd put her arm out through the curtain, and then the doctor would try to feel her pulses through all these layers of cloth. And then finally, she could ask women questions. She had been through every phase of a woman's life herself. She had been a little girl. She went through puberty. She was pregnant. She gave birth. And then, of course, later she got the wonderful gift of menopause. And then quite apart from the physical aspects of being a woman, she had experienced all of the emotions that women feel. And, so I'm going to just not talk about the positive ones here, but say things like sadness, resentment, anger. And so, it's believed that most of her patients, almost all of them, were the women and girls who lived in her husband's family compound. And this was an elite family, a very well-educated family, a wealthy family. And in those days, that meant you lived in this big compound home surrounded by a wall. And inside, you'd live with between 40 and 100 of your husband's relatives. My idea of hell. So, most of her patients are these elite women and girls. But they're also the people who took care of them. A scullery maid, a lady's maid, people like that. There are also a couple of other cases. A woman who holds the tiller on a ship. Another one who's a brick and tile maker. And these were the 2 cases that completely obsessed me. Because if Tan Yunxian was a good Confucian woman who was never supposed to go more than 3 steps beyond her front gate, how did she meet those women out there in the world? So, of course, this led me to doing research, my favorite part of the whole process. But All the libraries were still closed, all of the research libraries still closed, China still closed, and I had to approach this in a completely different way than I ever had before. Now, it is true, I've been writing these books for a while, and I feel like I do kind of have like a little bag of knowledge. So, 3 things I'll tell you about. First, she lived in a city called Wuxi, and Wuxi is a water town in the Yangtze Delta. I haven't been there, and I couldn't go there. But I had been to many of the other water towns in the Yangtze Delta. And the way to sort of visualize this is, you know, like in the Mississippi Delta, there are little towns built along the tributaries. The same thing in China, except these towns are built right on the water. And so the way to kind of visualize them is like little miniature, each one is like a little miniature Venice, only it's a little Chinese Venice, and lots of them. So although I hadn't been to Wuxi, I had been to many of these other water towns. The next really had to do with the house and garden where she lived. All of that, of course, is gone now. But I have been to many of these traditional Chinese homes, these big compound homes, when I've been doing research. I often think of this when I was working on the mysteries, which were fun. There are 3 of my mysteries out there from way back in the day. And I was coming back from the interior, and the driver said, oh, you know, I want to show you this house. And so we stopped, and here was this incredible compound that had been owned by the man who controlled salt in the region. And this was a huge compound. This wasn't just 100 people living there. There were 55 bedrooms, and all the pavilions and courtyards and all of this stuff, huge. And as I was walking through, I was like, this looks vaguely familiar. And it's because it was where they had filmed the movie Raise the Red Lantern. So if you've ever seen that, you know what it looks like. And now, if you haven't seen it, you can look it up, I don't know, on Netflix or something. And then the next had to do with the traditional garden that's attached to this compound. When I was working on Peony and Love, I spent a lot of time in Hangzhou, but particularly Suzhou, which is known for these large private gardens. And probably the most famous one is the oh my God. It's going to come to me at 3 in the morning. And I have an hour before I have to wake up. The Humble Administrator's Garden. Thank goodness. Okay, Humble Administrator's Garden. And so the garden in this novel is based very much on that, and on the traditional Chinese garden that's at the Huntington Library and Gardens in Southern California. And if you have ever go to Los Angeles, you should really go there, because it is it's a museum, it's a library, it's gardens, it's fantastic, it's 1,000 times better than Disneyland. But in all of these different gardens, there is one, a Chinese garden. It is the largest traditional Chinese garden anywhere in the world outside of China. And my cousin works there, and even though the world was closed, they let me come in and spend time in the garden while I was working on the book. So, and then finally, a bed, a marriage bed, traditional Chinese marriage bed. This is the first time I've really been inspired by an object. Now, again, we're an elite family. When you got married, you go to your husband's home with this incredible dowry that would have jewelry and clothes and food and money and property and furniture. And always included in that would be a marriage bed. And so it's like a sleeping platform surrounded on all sides by these kind of high carved walls. And easy to take apart, comes into like a stack about like this, so it can be paraded through the streets. And this gave a couple some privacy within, these larger homes. We have one in my family that we've had for well over 100 years. It's in our family store. And this one is 3 rooms, and it is the inspiration for the marriage bed that's in the book. And so this is carved out of about 20 different kinds of wood. It has a big carved canopy with wooden castles that hang down. The first room is where the servants slept on the floor in case you needed anything at night. The next room was the dressing room, and then you passed through a carved moon gate onto the sleeping platform that was surrounded on all sides by paintings on silk showing scenes of domestic bliss. You know, a young couple walking by the stream, she's playing an instrument, he's writing love poetry to her. This was my playhouse when I was a child. It's where I played with my cousins. It's where my sons played with their cousins, and of course now we're waiting for all of our grandchildren to be old enough that they can play there too. So what is my writing schedule like, and do I have a researcher who helps me? I do all of the research myself. It's my absolute favorite part of the process. To me, it's like a big treasure hunt. And I love it, you know, because I never know what I'm going to find. And so I'm just going to talk about the last book because I don't want to give anything away about this one, but with Island of Sea Women, this is about these divers, and one of the things, I just remember this so clearly because I was in the UCLA Research Library, and learning about these divers, and came across this thing that in the past and all the way to today, that one of the main ways these divers died was by harvesting abalone. And I'm sitting there in my little carrel, and I was just like, death by abalone. I've got to use that. And so, for me, it then becomes a question of, well, where is it in the story? Is it at the beginning, the middle, at the end? What's the ripple effect? Why is it there? My writing schedule, it takes about 2 years for me to write one of these. The majority of time is spent on the research. The writing is actually the least amount of time, and the editing is somewhere in the middle. When I'm writing, I only write 1,000 words a day. That's just 4 pages. Right now, while I've been on the road, I've been editing, just reading through where I am in the new book, which is page 291. And so, even though I'm traveling every day and talking to you guys at night, I am trying to just read like 15 pages and clean it up, and hopefully when I'm, done with that first draft, at least I will have cleaned it up a little bit. But yeah, that's my writing process. I try to work in the morning. I don't do very well, late afternoon or night. Anyone else? Yes?
Have you ever tried or know anyone that's done the medical potions?
Oh, have I ever tried or know anyone who has used traditional Chinese medicine? And I have been going to traditional Chinese medicine doctors since I was 19. And I know a lot, on the Chinese side of my family, certainly everybody has sort of both doctors. And I have. And the other thing is, so much of Chinese medicine, they have a saying that food is medicine. And so in Chinese food, there is so much just the daily food that you eat that is considered medicine. And the things you eat in the summer, the things you eat in the winter, the things you eat when you're pregnant, when you've had a baby. And you had a question.
I think we all agree that really good books, especially yours, change our lives, but I'm curious, how has this book changed your life?
So how has this book changed my life? I don't, okay. So I think the thing is, when I'm writing them, I don't have a sense of, I'm going to explore this. That's something that comes to me later. And I think what I have discovered about myself is that each time, and I only see it in retrospect, it's like I'm on some journey that I don't really understand. This was really clear with Tigro of Hummingbird Lane. That book, I think it was 12 days before it was due. My mom was diagnosed with cancer, and she died 10 days later. And, if you've ever, you're planning the memorial, you're taking apart someone's life, you're turning off the electricity, you're selling the, all of those things. And so it was really, and meanwhile, I had to turn the book in, did the editing, now it's copy editing and page proofs. And it was like 3 months later, I was reading through the manuscript, or I think it was already in page proofs, when it really hit me that here was a book, of all of my books, had more mothers and daughters in it than I think all of the other books put together. And that really, in the heart of that book, was separation. And so even though my mom had this diagnosis only at the very end, she had been sick for a while. It's just, there was just one thing after another. And so I think that sense of motherhood and losing your mother was just so in there, but it wasn't something I was really conscious of. So with this one, there were two things, I think. And one really had to do with what we were living through at that time. And I kept coming, as I'm doing the research, one thing that keeps coming through over and over again is that smallpox would pass through China every 3 years. And China invented something called variolation. It's a very early form of vaccination. It's something that kind of pops up in different countries around the same time. And a lot of people have said to me, did you use the language of today, but really we have to go back like 2 years ago, of the pros and cons of vaccination. And it's actually not at all what happened. I was really looking at what people were thinking about in that time about variolation. And so all of the things that people were saying back then, 500 years ago, again, pro and con, turned out to be what people were saying now. About 2 years ago, And so that was just something that was sort of, I think, kind of in the atmosphere around me. And then the other is that this is a novel about, obviously, friendship and this remarkable woman, but really it's a lot about women's health, women's bodies, women's reproduction. And the book was completely done, again, same thing, completely done when the Dobbs decision came down. And so it wasn't like I could go back in there and say anything one way or the other. But what really hit me in that moment was that this question about who has control over women's bodies has been with us since caveman days. It was there in Tan Yunxian's time. It's here with us right now today. And I feel really confident that in 500 years from now, when we're all living on Mars, people are still going to be arguing over this point. And so, if you're writing about women in this way, that was just so much a part of it. But it wasn't, again, in a kind of conscious way of, oh, this is going to be a topic when the book comes out. It was just more, so I don't know if that answers your question. I think I'm not conscious enough of that, but I think that's probably a good thing. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Yes?
What inspired you to start writing stories about these women from Asia and
So what inspired me to start writing these stories about women in Asia? So I did grow up in a very large Chinese-American family. My great-great-grandfather was an herbalist who came to work on the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. My great-grandfather came when he was 14 and he stayed. And there's a whole book out there on Gold Mountain about my family, so I won't go into all of that, but I will just say that he eventually did become kind of the godfather of Los Angeles Chinatown. And so when I was a kid, my mom's family was tiny, only about 10 people. Today only 4 left. But my father's side of the family was gigantic, probably 400 people in Los Angeles alone. And so when I looked around, I lived with my mom, but when I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and when I looked around, you know, what I saw were Chinese faces, what I experienced was Chinese culture, Chinese tradition, Chinese language, Chinese food, and that's why I write the kinds of books that I do. But I also, and this really started with Snowflower and the Secret Fan, and how, I'll just say how that book came to me and how I really do feel that that changed my life and kind of put me on a path, which was, I was reviewing a book for the LA Times on the history of foot binding. And in that book was just a 3 or 4 page mention of a secret language that women in this one small county in China had invented, used, and kept a secret for 1,000 years. The only writing system to have been found anywhere in the world used exclusively by women. And I just thought to myself, how could this exist? And I didn't know. But also, how could this exist and we all didn't know? That so often we hear about women in the past. There were no women writers, there were no women artists, there were no women doctors, there were no women architects, there were no women chefs, there were no women fill in the blank. But of course there were women who were doing those things. It's just so often what they did was lost, forgotten, or deliberately covered up. And that's what propelled me to write Snowflower, but that idea of finding those women's stories, lost, forgotten, or deliberately covered up, that you know, they inspire me. But it's more than that. It's that for all of us to be here tonight, we're all of us here on the backs and shoulders of the people who came before us. And we may not know their stories, but we should know their stories. And you know, it doesn't matter what I hope is that, yes, these books may have to do with China or Korea or Chinatown in Los Angeles, but that it doesn't matter where you're from or what your experience is, because the relationships and the emotions are what are universal. And the hardships and the struggles, you know, are universal. And so that, oh, I just sound like such a weird person. But that's it. That's it. Otherwise, I'm like a garden planting or something like that. You know, but that's what I'm trying to get at, is just find those stories that inspire me and hope that they inspire other people as well. Okay, one last question.
This might be unfair, but do you have a favorite, now it's unfair to ask if you have a favorite child, but do you have a favorite character? Or
Well,
a favorite
do I have a favorite character? And actually that is like asking if I have a favorite child. And you know the answer, it depends on the day. What I would say is that I do, and I think this is like with our kids, you know, you say you love them equally, but you do love them for different things. And I do have a different relationship with each one of them, and it has, you know, something sometimes to do with like where I was in my life when I was working on something. You know, it just really, you know, I don't know, I remember when my older son was getting married, and there's a lot of stuff about marriage and dreams of joy that really sort of comes out of that whole, like, you're planning a wedding. You know, so that those kinds of things permeate in that my books aren't autobiographical in the traditional sense, but my real life does seep in that kind of an emotional way. I guess if I really had to pick one, I would have to say On Road Mountain, which is my first book. It's a nonfiction book that tells the history of the Chinese in America through the eyes of my family. And the thing is, I would not be able to write that today. You know, all of those people are gone now. And so I can open it, and I can be with my grandmother, I can be with my father, I can be with my grandparents and uncles. And so that, you know, is very personal to me, and of course, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for all of them. All right, thank you all so much.